We've had a very interesting transference of energy across the central Atlantic. Originally, Hurricane Lee was one of the strongest systems we've seen during the Atlantic hurricane season in quite a few years. However, it is now undergoing cyclolysis, or a bit of a filling/weakening trend, as it continues to encounter some pretty heavy wind shear across its center of circulation. As a result, as you can tell on satellite imagery, it still looks a pretty ragged mess in comparison to what it once was a few days ago at peak intensity. Since then, it looks like Tropical Storm Margot is finally starting to get her act together and develop a little bit more thunderstorm activity in close proximity to her center, which could result in some intensification over the next few days. And as a matter of fact, if you look at our latest guidance in terms of what projected intensity could be, a lot of our models are in good agreement. We could see a Cat 1, maybe even a low-grade Category 2 out of her before she's all said and done out over the eastern Atlantic. Join me today while we reevaluate whether or not Hurricane Lee is really going to pose a substantial threat to any major landmass outside of Bermuda. We're also going to make a bit of a segue into a different topic altogether that is not heavily related to the tropics whatsoever. So join me today for this rather informative and educational episode of Weather Center Nazario as we ring in 25 with a bang. Alrighty, my lovely viewers, we're going to knock this one out of the park. You're taking a look at NHC's homepage right now. We still have good old Lee and Margot hanging out over the Atlantic. Ironically, despite the fact that I do believe we're going to see development in the MDR within the next 5, 6, maybe 7 days maximum, NHC still doesn't have anything in terms of a new disturbance to watch out for or an area of interest just yet. We have the 5 p.m. advisory for Hurricane Lee in, and he's still moving west-northwest at 10 miles an hour, and he's done nothing in terms of intensification or any additional weakening. As you saw previously during our introduction, he still looks pretty distorted out there on satellite, and I think the wind shear has definitely done a number on his internal structure. As we go forward in time, though, the National Hurricane Center wants to keep it as a major hurricane working its way off to the west-northwest before it finally makes its turn to the north sometime early to middle of the day Wednesday. As we segue over to Tropical Storm Margot, she has gained a little bit of intensity. She's now upwards of 45 miles per hour in the center, albeit a very tiny, microscopic almost looking wind field here on the chart anyways. It does still look favorable that she will strengthen into a hurricane as she projects further and further north outside of that heavily sheared environment and gets entrenched underneath a warm subtropical ridge where she can finally deepen, see some more of that thunderstorm activity continue to wrap around its vortex as we've already seen on the infrared previously, and finally become, I think, a Cat 1 hurricane. There are some weak indications we could get a Category 2 out of Margot. However, as she gets closer and closer to those upper northern latitudes, I think the window of opportunity for her to do so is only shrinking. So I'm going to go ahead and project out we can get a minimal, if not a moderate grade Cat 1 out of Margot before she wraps up into that northern pattern and disappears altogether. I wanted to show you real briefly, this is the wind shear analysis. You can see that Margot is still underneath a powerful pocket of 30-40 knots worth of wind shear, and the northern extremities of Lee are actually encountering 20-25 knots still out of the south and south-southwest, which is why it still seems like it's fanning out to the north-northeast when you look at it on satellite. That's what's really discombobulating his overall vertical structure, and we're still seeing some convective activity pop off near what was once the eye wall and the eye of the hurricane. I do think we will see some intensification, but until we can get out of that shrouded area of high wind shear, we're really not going to see much, and we'll just continue to see a modest major hurricane. I say that loosely because he once was a major Cat 5 hurricane. I want to kind of downturn it a little bit since we have seen quite substantial weakening over the last 24 hours. Still a dangerous storm, don't get me wrong, but it's definitely a lot different than it was 24 hours ago when it really deepened down and exploded the way that he did. Alright, really quick, this is just a little concerning, and why I continue to suggest that the northeastern coastline and some of my viewers up there in Canada should be watching this system. The 12Z Euro today, whereas it was previously segueing away from the east coast, we now see a projected landfall along the northeastern coastline as potentially still a Category 3 storm, if not maybe a very high-end Category 2. Regardless, though, this could be very concerning for folks up there. This is a very heavily populated area of the United States, especially closer to the Manhattan, Connecticut, Pennsylvania area and the greater New York area. So we definitely want to keep an eye out. It goes without saying, as I've been trying to mention, we don't have the highest confidence in terms of whether or not we're going to see a landfall or just projectile this out into sea. Jim Cantori has said it best, and I directly quote him, there's no reason to put up goalposts just yet. We don't have an official end zone, and I think we can take that with 100% confidence in terms of how little confidence we have on a landfall site. The GFS has kind of transitioned to the opposite end of the spectrum and is now calling for an eastern Canada landfall, staying away from our northeastern United States. You can see this band of precipitation right here, indicative of our trough and surface front that's going to help to eject this bad boy out to the North Atlantic, posing no harm or foul to the upcoming area of the northeastern coastline. However, if I go forward in time, look at Nigel trying to mimic Hurricane Lee and coming real close to the northeast coastline. They might get a buy one get one deal, unfortunately. We're not talking about Publix or Walmart in this case. Forgive me everybody in advance if it seems like I'm blasting through this. I really want to get to the educational segment after a lot of this information, especially since we haven't had any substantial changes out there in the tropical environment. I have noticed on the probabilities that we will likely see Nigel joining the fray or entering the battleground here very soon. At 72 hours, you can see that we are now up to a 70 to 75% chance of tropical depression development within the next 3 days. As you go through time, you only see this begin to strengthen and grow as Nigel takes shape, and within the next 5 to 7 days, as I mentioned when we were looking at National Hurricane Center's homepage, I'm surprised they don't have anything highlighted because the Euro ensembles are through the roof in terms of probability we'll at least get a depression out of it. You go on to tropical storm, and at 5, 6, and 7 days out, you can see that the threat is fairly low right now, but we're already getting into the 20-25 percentile threshold that even a tropical storm is likely to take shape, and those odds only go up as it traverses the Atlantic, headed towards the northeast coastline. Real briefly, after looking at the probabilities of seeing further development out over the central and eastern parts of the Atlantic, I just wanted to really quickly take a look at our multi-model ensembles, one of my new favorite overlays. This goes to show you how wide left and wide right that Lee is still looking at possibly going. We don't have a specific spot or point-based location as to where this could make landfall or just completely swing out and miss us altogether. So we have to keep watching. We have very good confidence over the next 2 to 3 days. As we go into next week, confidence really starts to diminish when you see these ensembles open up wide left and wide right like they do. Last but certainly not least, guys, we are back to weathernerds.org. We're going to just take a look at the overall big picture weather ensembles out there, and you can see that there is a really good amount of agreement that we will see Nigel take shape and possibly become our next hurricane out over the central Atlantic. Over the last few days, GFS has been trending that there is a bit of discontinuity in where it could possibly track, and we've seen some of the models want to traverse it into the Caribbean. So I personally don't think that's going to happen. It looks like we have a good synoptic setup in place to drive this system off to the north a la Hurricane Lee, but remains to be seen. This is pretty far out, 240s out into the future. 240 hours out into the future. So once again, as we've been harping on the last few episodes, as everybody's been communicating across the weather community, we just got to keep our eyes out, okay, guys? With that being said, thank you for listening to the Tropical Update segment of Weather Center Nazario, episode 25. Hang tight with me. We're going to get into some educational business now, so I'll see you in a moment. Now, before we wrap up episode 25 of Weather Center Nazario, I want to address the elephant in the room. That's been something everyone's been talking about since the start of the year. El Nino. What is the Nino? Well, El Nino is in fact Spanish for the Nino. I'm just kidding. No, guys. El Nino actually means little boy in Spanish. The full name initially used, as a matter of fact, was El Nino de Navidad. El Nino typically peaks around December. Now we typically associate El Nino strictly with hot water out in the Pacific and a reduction in the amount of hurricane activity we see in the Atlantic Basin. As we're all well aware of, that was not the case for 2023 and continue to look like it'll be very active until we get out of this peak realm. Now, why are we rehashing El Nino? I'm sure you're probably asking, and why are we talking about it on Weather Center? Because since I anticipate making this a year-round channel, this won't come to an end once tropical season is dead and gone. Want to continue providing you guys with the most updated information pertaining to the weather across North America and in the Atlantic Basin. Of course, as we all are well aware of, Atlantic hurricane season is going to come to a conclusion November 30th, 2023. And from there, I have to make sure I can continue to provide you guys with Weather Center episodes. So as a result, I'm closely examining what El Nino could possibly do for us later this year, particularly through November into the beginning of next year. If you aren't familiar with El Nino, or the Nino, as we used to call it over in Air Force weather, it is a rotational oscillation between the Pacific and Atlantic sea surface temperatures. As I've already alluded to, the El Nino condition will typically suppress any significant tropical activity for us in the Atlantic by way of increased wind shear. Sadly, as we were all already predicting at the start of hurricane season back in June, we figured that the war between hot ocean water and El Nino was going to be won in favor of the hotter water. Now, Hold on, because I want to inform you on what's to come, especially for the wintertime if you reside in the South or Southeastern United States. El Nino can affect our weather significantly. The warmer waters cause the Pacific jet stream or the subtropical jet to move south over its neutral position. With this shift, areas in the northern US and Canada are actually drier and warmer than usual. But in the US Gulf Coast and the Southeast, these periods are wetter than usual and have increased flooding. This will also likely increase our chances for severe weather in the form of thunderstorms repetitively with each synoptic feature that barrels through our neck of the woods, as well as the increased likelihood of seeing isolated tornadic activity and more tornado-producing thunderstorms because we're underneath such high levels of energy induced by the jet stream, the vorticity enveloped within the jet stream, and these larger-scale synoptic features driving the thunderstorm activity. Because the jet is troughed further south, we are not only going to be experiencing larger systems from up north, but we'll also be seeing a lot more in terms of temperature discontinuity because there's going to be greater contrast between the equatorial temps and the poleward temps closer to the upper United States and the Canadian provinces. So it looks like the winter season could be just as exciting as hurricane season, if not maybe even more exciting, since the way things are playing out, a lot of our significant systems out in the Atlantic could be driven away in response to these El Nino conditions already taking shape. If you take a look at this chart here, you can see we are actually already underneath a moderate El Nino oscillation. As a result, I think this is playing a role in providing us with a protective barrier from hurricane systems making their way towards the East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico. With each synoptic feature that troughs south over the Great Lakes mid-Atlantic states, these systems are picked up a la Hurricane Lee and shot out to the north, if not the northeast, doing no harm to anybody except maybe Bermuda. Sorry, Bermuda. I know you gotta hang tough and they're slinging in your way, but it's kind of the nature of the beast. Anyways, we'll save more information and more in-depth analysis of what El Nino could possibly do for us throughout the winter season, especially in the deep south and southeast going forward. But today, guys, thank you so much for tuning in to Weather Center Nazario. This is wonderful. We've reached a smaller milestone of episode 25. We're a quarter of the way to our first 100 episodes, and I thank you all so much for tuning in and showing the support that you have. I hope you're having a wonderful weekend and you continue to do so, and I'll see you tomorrow for episode 26. But until then, this is Weather Center Nazario, signing out.